Welcome back to the Ripewave audio community. My name is John, and for this video, we will look at the new JBL Synthesis 8K capable HDMI 2.1 compatible AV processor and AV receivers for 2022. And along with this examination of those new models, we will take a look at that other model in the JBL range, the SDP-75, and also compare it with sister brand Arcam and the AV41 processor and the AVR31 receiver, and see how these are different, because you do pay a little bit more for the JBL brand versus Arcam. But before we get into those details, let's have a high overview look from the Ripewave audio database and see where the market stands today. Now, this database now contains 194 models from 28 brands, but if we take away those that have been discontinued over the last few years, that brings it down to 120 active models from 27 brands that are AV processors or receivers. And of those, we now see 12 brands putting out 46 models with HDMI 2.1 8K capabilities. So that represents 38% of the active models out there. So we see products from Anthem, from Arcam, from Denon, Integra, JBL Synthesis, Lyngdorf, Marantz, McIntosh, Onkyo, Pioneer, Storm Audio, and Yamaha, all with HDMI 2.1 support. So this is probably a lot more than you might have expected, even myself, how this has really crept up. It's been a slow introduction, and some brands have done it better than others. And we've seen the challenges that Yamaha's had, Denon and Marantz as well, these early adopters. But now it really seems to have taken hold. Now, whether you really feel that 8K has advantages or not, the 2.1 features, which include eARC, which is not really part of the 2.0 specification, there are advantages even for those who are using 4K sources. So there are benefits for HDMI 2.1 support. Now, Ripewave Audio has covered most of these in videos to date. Now, we have a couple to catch up on. Anthem has recently released the AVM90. We're going to be doing a video on that. That's coming native with HDMI 2.1 versus the 70 still doesn't have it. And Storm Audio with their Mark III release has HDMI 2.1 as well. So those are two brands we still need to cover. But let's get into the JBL implementation. Now we'll first look at their flagship, the SDP-75. And we'll just look at the 16-channel model for comparison's sake. Now, this is really a different animal from the Arcam-derived models, but I thought I'd add this in for a little bit of comparison. We're not going to go deep on this one. This was a really, like I said, unique processor, which really is derived from Trinoff and their products. So they have that relationship with Trinoff. So whereas most of their range is derived from Arcam, the flagship is derived from Trinoff. And this is not unlike what McIntosh has done with their range. They have one model that's derived from Marantz and another model that's derived from Lyngdorf, and they've split it up, and they're not really creating any unique, fully built, developed product for AV receivers and processors under that brand specifically. So yeah, and when you look at these flagships, they are, starting at $27,000 US, and they go up as you configure them for more channels. There's lots of custom upgrades for that very specific product. But they start at 16 channels there, which is similar to the rest of the range. So we just put that into comparison, but as price-wise, these stand in a class of its own. So now let's get into the new model, the SDP-55 SDP-58 processor. At $6,900, the SDP-58 does, is still a pricey unit, but not at the same caliber as the flagship. So this is just released in 2022. In fact, I've seen this on a retailer's website before we even saw it on the JBL Synthesis website, and some details are still coming in to the website, so we're doing the best we can with the information provided. And when we look at this and we compare it against the model it's replacing, the SDP-55, cosmetically, we see just about the same thing. In fact, other than the model number on the lower left, on the front, these look the same. And of course, we do know that this is 8K capable, but that's really not anything that manifests itself on the exterior of the product. And if we flip these around, we're not seeing any changes on the back plane as well. The same inputs, the same outputs, the same layout there for this product. So very similar. Now, if we turn to the receiver model, the SDP-38, this one is more expensive because you got that amplification built in. So this is $8,550, still 16-channel unit, still risk released this year. This is 7 channels at 100 watts driven into all at once. If you just look at 2 channels driven, it goes up to 140 watts, both at the 8 ohm rating. It's also rated for 4 ohm. And when we look at side by side with the model it's replacing, the SDP-35, we can see that, again, they look the same. Now, we will note in as well on this model as what we showed previously, there is an increase in price. And we're not too surprised about that because most manufacturers are raising prices. So it is now $8,850 versus the prior model was $8,250. So there is a $600 increase. And likewise, the SDP-58 was a little bit more, but not quite as much, only $300 more than the SDP-55. For the meantime, we're seeing both the new generation and the old generation coexisting on the JBL Synthesis website, so I think you can choose the older model still at this point. And, flipping around the back of the SDP-38 and the 35, we're seeing no differences. Same I/O, same layout, everything is looking the same. So when we get into this even further, we're going to see, did we really gain anything with this beyond the 8K? What is the differences between the JBL Synthesis models and the Arcam? Now, we've talked about the relationship with Harman owning both Arcam and JBL Synthesis, as well as Lexicon. They also produce product for audio control, for their receivers, their processors. These are still very similar. Audio control has yet to update their range to support HDMI 2.1. And looking at the processors from the Harman brands here, as equivalent as they can be, the Lexicon they don't have a 16-channel model. The MC10 goes up to 12 channels. But you can see here that the JBL Synthesis is a premium price over Arcam, and Lexicon being their most entry-level brand. And same with the receivers. We don't have a receiver that is at the caliber of the SDP-75. So we have the AVR38 and the 31 versus the Lexicon, and similarly, the price jumps up with JBL Synthesis being the most expensive. And we can see here the power rating on the Arcam is the same as on the JBL Synthesis, etc. Looking inside these, I could not find a JBL Synthesis interior, but what I understand, the layout is the same. Here's just showing Arcam versus Lexicon. These aren't even some of the newest model from Arcam, but generally these all look the same inside. At least from a from a distant inspection, right, without looking at it too closely. Now let's get into the details, and I'll bring up one thing that Arcam and JBL Synthesis has in common, as well as with Lexicon, is the manuals are terrible. These are hard videos to do because they're not very clear, they're not very detailed. You really have to spend time kind of reading it carefully, trying to come up with the best conclusion as you can. I find discrepancies with what they have posted on the website, with what they have posted in the manual. You know, one case they had a model with the wrong weight and power consumption. They have the AVP values on the AVR. These are very hard, so I'm hoping I've got this as close as possible to the being accurate. If you find an error, please let me know, and we put that into our records for future use. So what we're seeing here is very consistent support for the processors and for the receivers as far as channels. We've moved to this new color coding last time we did one of these videos, where the gray is the fixed pre-out only channels. The blue is pre-out only channels that are configurable, so you might trade off a surround wides to some height channels, for example, or some back channels. In this case, the trade-off is you have to choose between a third row of heights and the front wide channels, and whether you're going to use those. On the receiver models, you also have a choice of what you have to get powered. So the front, left, center, and the side surrounds are always got power signal going to them for power. You have a choice to power either the first row of heights or the rear surrounds. So that's another choice you have to make. Now there's one difference I really want to point out between the Arcam and the JBL Synthesis is the distinct subwoofer outputs that can be independently controlled. So you can do up to 4 with the JBL Synthesis, where you only have one dedicated output for Arcam. We're going to get into that in a second. The other thing I'll point out is the SDP-75 has a specific configuration for the Oral 3D top center or voice of God channel, and I don't see that called out in the other models' manuals. The other difference on the flagship model is it supports DTS:X Pro. There's no Pro support on all the other models, albeit they do have DTS:X, as well as Oral 3D and Dolby Atmos are all supported. Like the Arcam, we're seeing an 1/8 inch phono jack for the headphones in there. A lot of the same support for networking, AM FM tuners in there, as well as removable IEC power cords. So a lot of consistency across there. The flagship model doesn't have a headphone jack, although the trade-off equivalent seems to. So it's something that they don't have on that. This next slide kind of gets into the subwoofer differences. I took some excerpts right from the manual, so you can judge for yourself. But the Arcam manual talks about a single subwoofer channel using 2 parallel outputs. To me, that's very clear. They're not doing discrete. With the JBL Synthesis, we get this other note here. While sub 1 and sub 2 are using a single subwoofer channel, when you use the other higher channels, 13 through 16, up to 4 independent subwoofers. So they use the word independent on JBL Synthesis manual, where they don't use that in Arcam. So that's why we're giving credit for independent subwoofer use on the JBL Synthesis versus Arcam. So there's one difference for the added price over Arcam. Looking back at the formats, they all support IMAX Enhance. I don't see Dolby Vision listed on their flagship, nor do I see that listed on Trinup's website either, but we see it for all the other Arcam and JBL models. Dirac Live is supported for all the non-flagship models. Of course, the flagship would be using the Trinup calibration system. Now on to the DACs. I don't have any details for the flagship on the DAC, but we know that the flagship model puts out a signal to noise of 118 decibel, which is amazingly high, and it should for the cost of that unit. But these models are all 24-bit, 192 kilohertz PCM conversion. We don't see any indication that they support DSD. The Arcam and JBL models all seem to have the same ESS Pro DAC in there, the 9026 chip in there, 2 of them per unit to handle all the conversion, which is a respectable DAC in there. Now, one discrepancy we see in the manuals, and here I'm not quite sure I can trust the manuals. I see one retailer advertising that they're all 100 dB, no matter what the make and model is from what's here. But if you look on the Arcam manual, it only says it in the manual, not on the website. There's no specification for signal to noise, but on the manual, it says 93 dB or 110 dB for analog direct connections. On the JBL equivalents, it says 100 dB for the digital and 110 for direct. So I'm just letting you know that they possibly are all the same, but if you go by the manual, the Arcam models don't put out as good of signal to noise there, but if that's true, then it does give a reason to pay more for the JBL Synthesis. They're all got a THD of a negative 100 dB. So that is for the DACs. Now let's look at the I/O. These are all the same. So whether it's Arcam or JBL Synthesis, whether you're anywhere in that range that's listed here on this particular slide, you're going to get 7 HDMI inputs, 3 outputs. You're getting eARC capabilities. You're getting 4 coaxial digital SPDIF signals, 2 optical, 1 optical out, and you're getting XLR outputs on the processor models of 60 for all 16 channels. You're getting full 16 channels output on RCA. You're getting 6 inputs for your analog sources. You're not getting a phono preamp, and you're getting some triggers in there. The flagship, the SDP-75, is a really unique animal, as I keep saying here. This one, it gives you AES EBU inputs, AES EBU outputs. You can configure this in a lot of flexible ways for doing active crossovers, etc. I am not going to get into those details, but you've got 32 through a DB25 connection outputs on that. You've got the AES EBU through a DB25 as well for those inputs. So very flexible, and how you can use this, very professional-like I/O configuration, although it's 16 channels of processing, but that's where the similarities end. So that's covered that. That will cover the I/O there. Looking closer at the HDMI, we've got, again, I said it was 7 inputs, 3 outputs. So on the older models, you don't have the 2.1. It's all 2.0B on those. They're not going to, it's going to only give you 60 frames per second on the 4K. So this is when moving up to the new models. Here's an advantage of upgrading or jumping into these, is it gives you 120 frames per second on 4K, 60 frames per second on 8K. It's giving you HDR10, HDR10 plus. But what we don't know, and we had the same problem when we reviewed Arcam, we don't know the full set of 2.1 features. Variable refresh rate, quick media switching, auto latency mode, etc. They don't specify it, either the website or the manual. This is important to that we know how much of the standard you're covering. In fact, that's what the HDMI organization wants to see vendors do. Harman is not doing that. It is copy protection 2.3 on the new models. The old ones are 2.2. Dolby Vision, IMAX Enhance, Hybrid Log Gamma are all supported. Looking now at the networking side, we see the typical Ethernet Wi-Fi support on these models, and so you're going to get those. Bluetooth is in only, not out to speakers and headphones. What makes JBL Synthesis unique compared to Arcam is their support for the Dante digital audio networking standard. And this is seen predominantly in professional audio setups. And so it isn't prevalent. And I look through the Dante catalog. And so this a company called Audinat, or Audinate, I believe, owns the standard. They release, they market the Dante system. And you look through, they got a big line card of manufacturers that support, and the closest products I could find that support it beyond these JBL Synthesis models are some active crossover devices from Trinoff, amplifiers from Audio Control, monitors from Genelec, and of course they have adapters and stuff you can use that are pretty universal here, but it really hasn't hit the home theater market, the Dante system. So JBL Synthesis is unique. So you're not going to find a lot of home speakers that support this or amplifiers. So you're likely going to use Dante to network and then convert it to something that's palatable to the end device, is what I feel, at least in the home market. For control, you're not going to have any voice control support from Harman brands. You do have control, integration control through Ethernet, through IR. You do have your triggers and everything. We do see more advertised support for integration with JBL Synthesis versus Arcam. So JBL Synthesis is explicitly talking about not just Control 4 and Creston support as with Arcam, but also Savant and RTI, as well as Elan and URC, which Arcam is not advertising. When it comes to streaming ecosystems, consistent between Arcam and JBL Synthesis, AirPlay 2, Chromecast, Roon support, and Spotify Connect. So I have a little correction over the Arcam one I did recently. I found additional information where Arcam did announce Roon support, although the core web pages, the manuals, don't talk about this. So again, this is what gets frustrating for me, is they do not update their information throughout when they add new features. Similarly, when we look at the internet streaming capabilities, the one thing that I had to correct here as well is MQA support. So Arcam did add in MQA support. JBL Synthesis did. This was something, I think it came with a firmware upgrade and from the older models, and now it's also in the new models as well. And we don't see a lot of products supporting MQA, so if that's important to you, go ahead. You know, this might be, other than NAD, one of the only other models that support MQA is from Arcam and JBL Synthesis. although I don't think it will last much longer, and that's for a topic for another day. V-Tuner, we also confirmed, is supported by Arcam and JBL Synthesis here. Looking at the remotes, all the Harman products share the same remotes except for this flagship, which has this very unique remote, which isn't surprising because they are sourcing this from Trinoff. So they did something different there for that model. It's interesting that you don't really get as sophisticated as a remote on the higher end model, because they're probably figuring you're going to just use that sparingly and move to some third-party remote system. Looking at the dimensions and the weight and the power consumption, the receivers are using up 1.5 kilowatts. I think this has got the highest power consumption of any receiver we've seen to date at 1.5 kilowatt maximum usage. These are heavy receivers. They're 40 pounds, 18.1 kilograms, but we're not seeing a difference in weight, power consumption, or size between these receivers, all consistent. So it suggests that Arcam and JBL are really sharing the same power supply and components in there. So it's another piece of evidence that would say that you're not really getting different hardware with the JBL Synthesis. The one clue that kind of does is if that specification on the signal to noise is actually right. So that's, but we're questioning that. We're questioning because you got the same DAC, you've got the same power supply, etc. How could it be that much more? For the processor models, these are all 50 watt power consumption, 10.6 kilogram, 23.4 pounds. So again, same weight, the same dimensions. The flagship uses a little more power on that processor, 100 watts. It is a little heavier, 30.8 pounds, 14.5 kilograms, but a little smaller on the packaging. Looking at the UI, you know, it's got an LCD screen on the front of these JBL Synthesis models. Again, there was no change over the prior model. I'm going to go through this quickly because I really didn't do a deep dive on the UI, but it's the same UI as they had in the prior generation. And so this is where you configure your channels and your die rack and everything. And there isn't anything exceptional here. They do have their mobile app, which is called Harman Music Life. It looks like standard fare there, but this wraps it up. So I can conclude the following differences. Again, as a summary for you here, is one, they all have terrible manuals. There's inconsistency with the websites. The subwoofers appear to be independently controlled, up to 4 of them for the JBL Synthesis. While you can connect 4 subwoofers to the Arcam models, they're not independently controlled. We've got that note about the specification. The signal to noise reporting for Arcam is only 93 dBs versus 100 dB for JBL Synthesis. You also get the Dante networking capabilities. So there's a primary and a secondary port. There are RJ45 type connections on there. And you get more claimed integration support from these third-party companies like RTI, etc. So those are the differences. So what are your thoughts? Do you feel like the differential in price between Arcam and JBL Synthesis is worth it? Do you feel like the upgrade between the 35 and the 38 receiver and the 55 and 58 processor justify the enhancement, the main enhancement you get when you go from those models up to the newest ones? It appears only to be HDMI 2.1 support. Is that worth it to you? What are your thoughts? That feedback would be useful to the Ripewave Audio community. And if you enjoyed this video, Please like and subscribe to this community. And be sure to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when the next video is posted. Until then, keep evolving your audio experience.